Okay, hello YouTube. Today I'm going to show you how to win 90% of your king and pawn endgames without ever having to calculate anything. So basically just understanding the concepts and the principles of all king and pawn endgames to the point where the majority of the time, if you just follow the principles, you won't really have to calculate a single line. So anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So basically, all king and pawn endgames can be broken down into 5 basic concepts: opposition, outflanking, zugzwang, the zone of the pawn, the box of the pawn. Now if you understand all 5 of these concepts, 90% of your king and pawn endgames are easy, and you really don't have to calculate anything at all. You just follow these principles, and then the moves are very, very obvious. So this exercise teaches the first 3 of these concepts. It teaches opposition, outflanking, and zugzwang. So here you're already learning 3 out of 5 with just one exercise. And guess what? In this exercise, there's just 2 kings on the board. There's nothing else. I don't have any pawns. So the goal of this very simple exercise is you start with 2 kings on the board, and it's white's move. And all white has to do is get his king to one of these 2 squares, one of these 2 highlighted squares. That's the goal. So the point is, if white takes, say, the direct approach, if we just play king b2, black can play king b8. And already, when black has played king b8, black has what we call the opposition. He has prevented white from getting to one of these 2 goalposts. He's prevented white from getting to one of these 2 squares. Now, how can we tell that black has the opposition? Well, the long answer is there's an odd number of squares between the kings, in this case 5 squares, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it's white's move. Therefore, black has the opposition. The short answer to this question is the kings are on the same color square. And that's the shortcut. You don't have to calculate anything. As long as the kings are on the same color square and it's your opponent's move, you have the opposition. So in this case, because black has the opposition, white is never able to outflank. So for example, if we just maintain the opposition, and then as white tries to go over, we just keep maintaining that opposition. We keep blocking him. Eventually we'll get to this point where white can't make any further progress because the king is blocking both of his entry points to try to outflank. And as long as we continue to maintain that, the king will continue to block white's forward movement. He's blocking all of white's squares where white can go forward. So effectively right here, white is in zugzwang, which just means the obligation to move. White has the obligation to move, which is bad. He would rather not be moving here. He would rather black move, and then he could go. But he's not allowed to pass. You're not allowed to pass in chess. Therefore, white has to move, and because white moves, he can never outflank black, and he can never get to his goalposts. So if we go back all the way to the beginning, the correct move is for white to simply move his king up 1 square, to move it to a1 to a2. Because now white has the opposition. The kings are on the same color square, which means without even having to count, there is an odd number of squares between the kings. So we don't have to calculate anything. We don't have to count. We know there's an odd number because we're on the same color square, and it's our opponent's move. So now if we play out this same scenario, as long as we continue to move to the same color square, and even here, if we just follow the rule of moving to the same color, we can actually outflank here, or we can just get traditional opposition. Either one works. And then we can keep that opposition, and at this point, black has to give way, and now we're going to outflank, which simply means we're going to aim at the square that we want to go to. So here, we're going to get this opposition, where the kings are 1 square apart, odd number. The black king is going to have to give way. The black king is currently in zugzwang, meaning he has the obligation to move. And then when the black king moves, we are going to outflank. We're going to outflank, and we're eventually going to get to our goal. So you might be wondering, why do these 3 concepts matter? Opposition, outflanking, zugzwang. Where do we use these in king and pawn endgames? Well, we use them in pretty much every king and pawn endgame. So to demonstrate, I'm going to show you a very basic king and pawn endgame. A king, a pawn versus a king. How do we win this? Well, we use the concepts of opposition, outflanking, and zugzwang. So the very first move is we gain opposition with this move king e4. The kings are 1 square apart. The black king is in zugzwang. The black king is forced to give way. And then we're going to make our king go forward towards one of our goalposts. In this case, the goalposts are squares that escort the pawn up the board. So any of these squares on the sides of the pawn are going to protect this pawn's path as it moves up the board. And as it protects that path as it moves up the board, as it protects these squares that are next to that pawn's path, the black king will not be able to prevent that pawn from making progress. So that's the opposition and the outflanking that we see in these endgames. So it would continue something like king e7, king e5, getting the opposition again. Then we could push our pawn 1 square, not 2, because when the king goes back to e7, we want to push it 1 square and gain that opposition. Same color square, it's our opponent's move. And you don't have to calculate that, really. You just need to make sure you push your pawn 1, and then you push it again so that when the king gets to e7, you have your opposition. So king moves, outflank, outflank, and now we've covered the last 3 squares. So as soon as the pawn moves forward to e5, those last 3 squares are completely covered. Now we can simply play, e6, e7, e8 without even thinking, because we've gotten to, in this case, our goalposts. Pretty much in any king and pawn endgame, these squares on the 7th rank are going to actually be your goalposts. They're not going to be on the 8th rank. They're going to be on the 7th. And we're just going to push that pawn until we make a queen. And guess what? We just made a queen and we won. So that's the first 3 concepts: opposition, outflanking, and zugzwang. Now, I mentioned we can win 90% of all king and pawn endgames just by knowing 5 concepts. The other 2 concepts are the zone of the pawn and the box of the pawn. So stay tuned. Watch the rest of this video, because once you learn about all of these, you're never going to have to calculate a king and pawn endgame again. So zone of the pawn, box of the pawn. So let's learn about the first of these concepts, which is actually kind of cool, which is basically the box of the pawn. So we're going to learn about the box of the pawn first, and I'm going to show this kind of insane example that talks a little bit about the box of the pawn. And it's an example that a lot of people show, and they show it, there's varying degrees of showing this example. Some of it will have just the passed h pawn, some of it will have, I've seen some examples on the internet where they have it like this, where they have basically 3 pawns. But understanding the box of the pawn, and understanding another important concept that comes with the box of the pawn, is to understand the shortest distance between 2 points in chess. It's not a straight line. It's a triangle. And that's why we draw boxes with pawns. Okay, so right now the black king is inside the box of this pawn. Okay, so the black king effectively has this pawn stopped. And of course the white king right now is behind these pawns, so you would think white should be completely lost here. And he's not. This is actually white to move and draw. And it's a really interesting position. But once you understand the concept, you'll be able to find white's moves really easily. Actually, you'll be able to find white's moves without thinking very hard about them. So the point is what is the fastest way for white to get from here, the square that he's on, this h8 square, down to, say, this h2 square? If we count the number of squares, if we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, if we go in a straight line, it would take us 6 moves to get here. But what's interesting is because of the way the box of the pawn works, notice I draw a box and I said, hey, if this black king is anywhere inside of this box, it can stop the pawn. That means that all of these squares are basically equivalent. It's the same. And there's actually a whole bunch of different paths between h1, between this h8 square and this h2 square, that are exactly the same number of moves. But some of them travel really far. So this is the straight line. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We could also go like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Same number of moves. And actually we can take just about any path within this triangle. It'll be the same number of moves. We could go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Still the same number of moves. We could travel the exterior of this triangle. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 moves. Same number of moves. And that's because in chess, we don't measure distance with like a tape measure. Okay, the king isn't taking a longer journey by going down the diagonal sides of the squares. We measure distance in squares. The king is moving 1 square at a time. And so the distance is measured in squares. He's moving 6 squares by moving diagonally in this triangle. He's also moving 6 squares by moving in a straight line. So whether or not you even know that this position is a draw or if it's a win for black, your move should be obvious. You should move in a diagonal line towards black's pawns, but also towards your own pawns. So your path should be really clear. You should be moving in this diagonal line right here towards that square, because that's the square, that's the distance it's in between. So you should just immediately play a move like king takes g7. Now, what's truly amazing about this is even if you had played the direct move, king takes h7, you're still drawn here, just barely. Like, you can play king b6, king takes g7, f5, and then go on a diagonal path towards the black pawn, but also towards your pawn. And here you're touching your pawn, his pawn, but you're also touching the support square for your pawn to save your pawn. And here white saves the draw, because if black takes your pawn, you take his pawn, and if the black pawn runs, you support your pawn, and you both queen at the same time, and you get a draw. Now, the easiest way to draw is by far and away just to take on g7, and then, let's say, h5, you can take on f6, king moves over, and then you could play c7, king g5, because you're in the box of that pawn. Now, if the king doesn't move over, if they say push this pawn again, like play pawn to h4, now you go to this diagonal square, and you're inside, you're threatening the box of this pawn, and you're also threatening to support your own pawn. So now if this pawn makes a run for it, you give up on chasing this pawn. Instead, you support your own pawn, and then when he pushes, you push. And now if he pushes, you push and make a queen with check. If he tries to stop your pawn, you bring your king up. He makes a queen. You make a queen with check, and this position is a draw. So from a position that's seemingly lost, just because of the geometry of the chessboard, because of how the chessboard works and how the zone of the pawn works, and how triangles in chess work, white is okay. White is saving this game. So the next concept is what we call the zone of the pawn. So, like I said, like 90%, all we need to know is the box of the pawn and the zone of the pawn. Okay, so the zone of the pawn is another kind of interesting concept, and I'm going to give this very simple example for the zone of the pawn. Okay, so right here, we have two pawns that are facing each other. They're in locked positions. And we have a zone of the pawn that I've highlighted for each pawn. So black's zone is the 3 squares to the right or left of the pawn. Now, of course, here we run into the edge of the board, so it's just 2 squares on one side and 3 squares on the other side. And for white, it's the same thing. White's zone is there and there. So the rule is, and this is the rule, whoever can touch the zone of the other person's pawn first, or whoever can touch the opponent's pawn first, or whoever can get to the zone first, should be winning that pawn, and therefore winning the game, should be able to create zugzwang. So here's kind of an interesting situation. If white plays his next move, king h3, white should be completely lost because black is capable of touching the white pawn first. Now what's interesting is if black does touch the white pawn first, and this is an important concept to understand about the zone of the pawn and to understand about zugzwang and king of pawn endgames and how all these things start working together, if black actually plays this move first, if he plays here and hits the pawn, white will play king here, and white is the one with zugzwang. Black has to give way, white captures black's pawn, and white wins. So it's having the ability to touch that square makes black winning, because he got to touch that square first, but the way to win this is if your opponent is also, you just move here. Now, king here is winning because since you had the ability to touch that square first, now you're touching 2 squares that touch that pawn because you got further into the zone first. So now, if white moves here, you have zugzwang. Black now has zugzwang. White moves away, you take, black wins. And if white chooses a different path, if white moves here, we touch the back of that pawn. This will force white to defend it. And then we slide our king back, and now we have zugzwang again. The white king has to move away, we take, and we win. And actually any other idea that white can come up with. If white hangs out back here, then we can either move here or here, and then the king will be forced to move away, we take the pawn, and we win. So understanding just how the zone of the pawn works and the basic mechanics of the zone of the pawn and how that works is really fundamental to understanding endgames. And that's why when I see endgames like this, now that we've covered kind of all 5 concepts, we've covered the box of the pawn, the zone of the pawn, opposition, outflanking, we've covered in that umbrella, within the box of the pawn, we've covered how triangles work with kings. That's why when I see people show endgames like this, and they just kind of ask, and I'm going to bring up this endgame real quick, this endgame, and it's sort of a puzzle. I've seen this puzzle a whole bunch, and people show this puzzle in short videos on chess. and I see this puzzle a whole bunch, and it's just like, it's white's move and win, and I'm like, I don't have to calculate a single variation. I mean, this is silly. Why am I calculating this? No, I don't. I don't have. If somebody shows me this is a puzzle, I don't have to calculate this. I know that the only way that white has any chance of winning is by taking the long route to get to one of these two squares that will support this pawn, because I understand opposition outflanking zugzwang, and I understand that the fastest path for a king is a triangle. So of course I need to move away from the black king as far as possible. If the black king's over here, I'm going to move this way. If the black king was positioned over here, I would want to move this way. Okay, so wherever the black king is positioned, I want to move far away from him to have some chance of winning. Even if the position is objectively a draw, my best chance to win is going to be to move away from the king. So I don't have to calculate a single line in a practical game. I just have to move away from his king to get to one of my outflanking squares where I can support my pawn and I can try to make a queen. So in this particular case, this should be winning. If I play king f2, king here, I can manage to get around to the back end of this pawn, and I can get to my support square before black can stop me. I can gain opposition, and then I can outflank. And of course, there is no other way to win. If I go back to this position, and I decide, hey, let me pop out in front of my pawn this way, I am going to have a draw as soon as black gets the opposition, because I moved towards his pawn when I didn't have to. I could have just as easily moved away, just like in the box of the pawn exercise. It's the same distance, so why not take the wider route? Why not take the route away from his king to avoid the possibility of his king getting opposition and his king preventing you from making forward progress? So we can, of course, take the logic as well of the zone of the pawn, and we can apply that to a much more complicated endgame. So take a look at this endgame right here. This endgame is actually pretty complicated, but we can break it down into something very simple. We have a zone of the pawn right here. This zone is these three squares. So let's imagine for a second that this endgame were just slightly different. Let's say that instead of the king being on the b6 square, let's say that this king was on the b7 square. So if this king were on the b7 square, we would have a super easy win. All we have to do is push this pawn, and after captures, we capture, and we're in the zone of the pawn, and we already know that no matter what black does, he can't stop us from getting to that pawn on the d5 square, and we know that the game is effectively over. We know that we're going to take that pawn, and that's going to be it. So when we go back to the beginning of this endgame, so we're going to go back to the absolute beginning of this, we know about this zone, and we know that if we can get black to move, that we're winning. So what's left at this point is just trying to calculate what's going on over here. And it's not going to be a long calculation, it's going to be a short calculation. Because we know that all we need to do is get black to move. So we need to make a couple little 1 or 2 move calculations. We don't need to calculate long lines, we don't need to see 20 moves ahead. We just need to make some short calculations. Like, okay, if I play f5, and they play this, g5. If I play here, I win. Yay! But okay, what if they take? Because that's another possibility. They could take, I could take, they play here, and oh, I'm sad, I don't win. Because it's white's move, and if it's white's move, I don't win. Because now black has the zugzwang, white has to give up that square, white has to move his king back, and I'm not going to make progress once I move my king back because he can get the opposition, and I can never get to the zone of the pawn, and therefore I don't win. So if we know that this doesn't work, and we know that this doesn't work, it leaves g5. And we know that g5 won't lose. So even without calculating a line, if we don't care about the result, we know that g5 has to be the best move, whether it wins or loses. We know that it has to be the best move. I mean, it can't lose. We know that it's either going to win or draw. So without calculating a single variation after g5, we can actually just play g5. We don't have to calculate it. We just know that it's the best move because we know that f5 and h5 don't work. So we can play g5, and now, no matter how black captures, we actually should be winning. So let's say they play h captures g5. Now what's interesting here is there is a little bit of calculation here. So if we play h captures g5, they're going to push that pawn, and again, it's our move, so we can't possibly win. So if we want to win, we need to play this capture, or we need to push. And this does require a little bit of calculation, because, you know, some of this is going to be winning, some of it is going to be a draw. Now this is, I admit, like a little bit harder to calculate. This is actually a draw. Like if we take here and then we push, Our pawn's going to make a queen first, but they're going to also make a queen. So if we do this, they're going to make a queen as well. They're going to just play f4, and this is going to be equal because we're way, 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 way outside of the box of that pawn. Which means that if we push down and make a queen, and they push down and make a queen, and we both make queens, we'll still be okay. We're going to have at least a perpetual here, even though black is up a couple of pawns. But, of course, this is not ideal. We don't want both players to queen at the same time. So we know that that capture is not correct. We know that the other capture, this pawn capture, is not correct because they're going to push. So the only capture that could possibly work is this one. And if we take this way and they push, we know that we're safe because as soon as we play here, we're only 3 squares away from queening. So at the very least, we know that we're going to queen. So the only question we have to ask ourselves is, does king b3 win? And of course it does. King b3 just gets to the zone of this pawn, the box of this pawn, actually. It gets to the box of the pawn, and now our pawn is going to be here, and this is the box. And this black king is outside of the box of that pawn, and our king is inside of the box of this pawn, and therefore we win. Just by understanding the box of the pawn, not having to calculate a single line. There's no long calculations here. You know that you win, because you're inside the box of that pawn, and the black king is outside of the box of your passed pawn. So if we just play through a basic line, like king b5, h5, f4, e takes f4, our king is inside of the box of this other passed pawn, e3, king c3, e2, king d2, we're inside the box, king b4, and this pawn is a million miles away from queening. We're going to queen. He's not going to be anywhere near queening, and we're going to win. Just by understanding the box of the pawn, not having to calculate a single line. After this, just king b3, understanding. We're in the box, he's out of the box, that's it, it's over. And also by understanding the zone. So in this complex endgame, all that we needed to understand were two things. We needed to understand the zone of the pawn, and we needed to understand the box of the pawns that were threatening to make a queen. If we understood those two things, the most we ever had to calculate was 1 to 2 moves ahead. And that was it. And this is a complex endgame. This is a complex king and pawn endgame. So in very simple king and pawn endgames, we shouldn't have to calculate at all. Like, we should calculate basically 0 moves ahead. And anyways, that is how you win 90% of king and pawn endgames without having to calculate a single line. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess. I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.